welcome Jamie Whitledge.
He's been called the most remarkable American most people have never heard of. And few people today know who Robert Ingersoll was. And yet in the second half of the 19th century, this great orator and freethinker packed auditoriums around the country. He spoke in every state but 3. People would come on horseback from miles around to hear him speak. His admirers included Mark Twain, who called Ingersoll the greatest master of the English language he had ever seen. Walt Whitman was also a great friend and admirer. Ingersoll influenced, to name a few, Clara Barton, Frederick Douglass, W.C. Fields, H.L. Mencken, Margaret Sanger, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Thomas Edison. Clarence Darrow called him one of the bravest, grandest champions of human liberty the world has ever seen. Ingersoll fought during the Civil War in the Battle of Shiloh and would carry the name Colonel Bob for the rest of his life. About their battles, a fellow soldier quipped some years later, he saw enough to believe in hell. A fierce opponent of slavery, the Civil War would be Ingersoll's first battle against oppression, followed by a lifelong battle against ignorance, the slavery of the mind. So why is Ingersoll forgotten today, despite the 12 volumes of essays and lectures he left behind, and despite his great fame? There's even a mountain and a wilderness area named for him in Olympic State National Forest in Washington State. You can see that on the poster here. It seems he has been forgotten for the single reason that he was an agnostic who spoke out fearlessly against church orthodoxy, the clergy, and the misuses of the Bible. Ingersoll also insisted on the separation of church and state, which was the founders' intention. He argued that the country was not founded as a Christian nation, an issue that is still politically divisive to our day, in our day. Here's Ingersoll on separation of church and state and how America formed. How America formed the first secular government, the first government that said every church has exactly the same rights and no more. Every religion has the same rights and no more. In other words, our fathers were the first men who had the sense, had the genius, to know that no church should be allowed to have a sword. They knew that to put God in the Constitution was to put man out. They knew that the recognition of a deity would be seized upon by fanatics and zealots as a pretext for destroying the liberty of thought. They knew the terrible history of the church too well to place in her keeping or in the keeping of her God the sacred rights of man. They intended that all should have the right to worship or not to worship. They wished to preserve the individuality of all, to preserve the few from governing the many, and the many from persecuting and destroying the few. If God had been in the Constitution, which God? The God of the Catholics, Ingersoll asked, the God of the Puritans, the enemy of joy, the Baptist, and so forth, he asked. What God is it proposed to put in the Constitution? Is it the God of the Old Testament who was a believer in slavery? What court is to define this God? And who is to make known the will of this God? Will there be a supreme tribunal composed of priests? Ingersoll's attacks on politicians mouthing God's name in order to win elections still ring a bell today. It's almost a rule that politicians must talk of their faith to get votes. The mention of God is very nearly required to win political office. Wouldn't that be nice, to rid ourselves of the God that enables scoundrels to win elections? In her wonderful biography of Ingersoll, Susan Jacoby writes, eliminate a few Victorianisms and everything Ingersoll had to say in his time is just as relevant to a nation in which religious censors are still trying to eliminate the very idea of the separation of church and state from the school history books. Robert Green Ingersoll was born on August 11, 1833, to Mary Livingston Ingersoll and the Reverend John Ingersoll in the little town of Dresden in upstate New York. His birthplace is a museum on the National Register of Historic Places. You can see that also on the poster here. His father was a Congregationalist preacher and also a fierce abolitionist. Robert's mother died when Ingersoll was an infant. At one point in her life, just after New York had banned slavery, his mother had circulated a petition to end slavery in the District of Columbia. It was considered a scandal for a woman, especially a preacher's wife, to be politically active. Ingersoll's awareness of his mother's bravery made him a lifelong champion of women's rights. The Ingersoll family moved often due to the Reverend Ingersoll's preaching against slavery. The anti-slavery sermons would eventually irritate people, and the family would be forced to move on to the next town. Robert and his 4 siblings attended many different one-room country schoolhouses as they moved about several times in Ohio. In an essay titled "The Liberty of Man," Ingersoll described the typical Sunday in a minister's household. No matter how cold the weather was, there was no fire in the church. It was thought to be a kind of sin to be comfortable while you were thanking God. The first church that ever had a stove in it in New England divided on that account. There was a sermon and then came the catechism. The minister asked us if we knew that we all deserved to go to hell if it was God's will, and every little liar shouted yes. Ingersoll says the service lasted all morning, and if we had been good boys and the weather was warm, sometimes they would take us out to the graveyard to cheer us up a little. It did cheer me. When I looked at the sunken tombs and the leaning stones and read the half-effaced inscriptions through the moss of silence and forgetfulness, it was a great comfort. The reflection came to my mind that the observance of the Sabbath could not last always. He mentions a well-known hymn about the afterlife, where congregations ne'er break up and Sabbaths never end, and remarked, "These lines, I think, prejudiced me a little even against heaven." Hell comes up a lot in Ingersoll's lectures. He told of a liberating moment in his childhood when he stayed with his Aunt Candace, his father's sister. She was a feisty sort of woman, not afraid to make fun of the fire and brimstone preachers. Young Robert attended a revival with his aunt and uncle, and the preaching was particularly horrendous on eternal damnation. On the way home, his aunt made fun of the revivalists, and when they got home, little Robert jumped up on a stool and mimicked the preacher. Many years later, Robert said his Aunt Candace was the first relation I ever saw that had sense enough to deny the infamous doctrine of eternal punishment. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your good and brave words. And he goes on to say, one cannot imagine what the human heart has suffered by reason of the frightful doctrine of eternal damnation. It is a doctrine so abhorrent to every drop of my blood, so infinitely cruel, that it is impossible for me to respect either the head or heart of any human being who teaches or believes it, who teaches or fears it. This doctrine necessarily subverts all ideas of justice. To inflict infinite punishment for finite crimes, or rather crimes committed by finite beings, is a proposition so monstrous that I am astonished it ever found lodgment in the brain of man. Whoever says that we can be happy in heaven while those we loved on earth are suffering infinite torments and eternal fire defames and calumniates the human heart. And in the lecture, The Great Infidels, he wrote, all the meanness, all the revenge, all the selfishness, all the cruelty, all the hatred, all the infamy of which the heart of man is capable grew, blossomed, and bore fruit in this one word, hell. He is capable. Ingersoll said that nothing gave him greater joy than to know the belief in eternal pain was growing weaker every day, that ministers were becoming ashamed of it. They ought to know that their belief in hell gives to the Holy Ghost, the dove, the beak of a vulture, and fills the mouth of the Lamb of God with the fangs of a viper. Ingersoll was asked once by a reporter if he enjoyed lecturing. He replied, "Of course I enjoy lecturing. It's a great pleasure to drive the fiend of fear out of the hearts of men, women, and children. It is a positive joy to put out the flames of hell." Ingersoll wrote about some Christians, "I show them that hell does not exist, and they denounce me for destroying their consolation." To illustrate the self-deception of religious faith, he told an anecdote. Horace Greeley one cold day went into a country store, took a seat by the stove, unbuttoned his coat, and spread out his hands. In a few minutes, a little boy who worked in the store said, "Mr. Greeley, there ain't no fire in that stove." "You damned little rascal, why did you tell me for? I was getting real warm." Some have said that Robert's rebellion against religion came from his strict upbringing and anger against his father, but this is not so. Robert loved his father, called him a tender man, a father who loved his children almost to insanity. Robert's father was subjected to several church trials throughout his career because of his abolitionism. Robert was angered by the hypocrisy and meanness of the church when his father was brought to trial, especially in Radisson, Ohio, on drummed up and trivial charges in order to keep him from preaching against slavery. And he did lose his pastorate, although he would regain it later. These trials, as well as his reading, influenced him the most. The Reverend Ingersoll assigned young Robert readings from the King James Bible, and Robert memorized passages in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. About his 5th year of school, he studied declamation, or performance reading. Robert Ingersoll's first effort at speech was not promising. I paraphrase a biographer here. Robert had memorized one of Thomas Hood's poems beginning, I remember the cot where I was born," and his fine performance attracted public attention. He was invited to speak at an entertainment in the Baptist church. Young Robert walked to the platform, bowed, and couldn't remember a single word. He walked back to his chair tearfully and thought he now remembered, and well-wishers cried, "Try again." He walked back to the platform, bowed, and forgot again. He finally returned to his chair and said, "Clark knows it." Clark was his brother. It would be a long time before Ingersoll would speak in public again. Robert read widely from his father's library, gloomy and grotesque books such as Fox's, no relation to, not the Fox of the Quaker Church, Fox's famous Book of Martyrs, which gave him horrible nightmares, Richard Baxter's The Saints' Everlasting Rest, William Paley's Moral and Political Philosophy, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and the works of John Milton. Ingersoll's skepticism was aroused early from being exposed to so many religious books. Robert attended the Greenville Academy in southern Illinois after the family had moved once again from Milwaukee. Bob was 17. The school was held in the basement of the Congregational Church, where his father was the preacher, and was run by a teacher named Socrates Smith. Robert was a mischievous student. The teacher had a habit of reading the same dreary scripture verse every day. Robert is said to have put a dead goose in the teacher's desk, the top of which raised up. The goose was propped with its bill on the offending verse. When the teacher asked who had put the dead goose in the desk, Robert cried out, "Are there any Judases in this school?" Soon after, Ingersoll left the academy, and Robert's formal education was over. Like Lincoln, Ingersoll was mostly self-taught. He soon discovers the work of Robert Burns. He wrote, "Here was a man who plucked joy from the mire, made goddesses of peasant girls, and enthroned the honest man. One whose empathy embraced all forms of suffering life, who hated slavery of every kind, who loved this world, this life, the things of every day, and placed above all else the thrilling ecstasies of human love." So all the religious and lugubrious poets are left behind. Burns was Robert's awakening. Shakespeare, too, thrilled him, and he would one day give lectures on both. He loved Byron and Keats, but it was Shakespeare first and Burns who were his favorites. Ingersoll often stated, "Shakespeare is my Bible, Burns my hymn book." Robert read much and widely and was excited by what he found in the books, the discoveries, the arguments. The great thinkers, Gibbon and Paine and Epicurus and Darwin, Huxley and Hegel, all finally freed him from the religious straitjacket. He wrote, "When I became convinced that the universe is natural, that all the ghosts and gods are myths, there entered into my brain, into my soul, into every drop of my blood, the sense, the feeling, the joy of freedom. The walls of my prison crumbled and fell. The dungeon was flooded with light, and all the bolts and bars and manacles became dust. I was free. Free to think, to express my thoughts, free to live my own ideal, free to live for myself and for those I loved, free to reject all ignorant and cruel creeds, free from the fear of eternal pain. There was no prohibited place in all the realms of thought. I was free. I stood erect and fearlessly, joyously faced all worlds. And then my heart was filled with gratitude, with thankfulness, and went out in love to all the heroes, the thinkers, who gave their lives for liberty, who died in dungeons, bound with chains, to those who proudly mounted a scaffold stairs, to those whose bones were crushed, whose flesh was scarred and torn, to those by fire consumed, to all the wise, the good, the brave of every land, whose thoughts and deeds have given freedom. And then I vowed to grasp the torch that they had held and hold it high, that light might conquer darkness still. Let us be true to ourselves, true to the facts we know, and let us above all things preserve the veracity of our souls. An error cannot be believed sincerely enough to make it a truth," he wrote. In Marion, Illinois, after a stint at teaching, Robert took a job as assistant to the clerk of the county and circuit courts. Like Lincoln, Ingersoll learned law by studying in a country law office. The clerk's son, Josh, had very liberal views on religion, and the two young men talked for hours about religious questions. John Ingersoll, Robert's father, suddenly wanted not only to preach, but to see slavery firsthand. He and Robert made a trip to Tennessee and then to Alabama. Robert wrote of this time, "Our sympathies were everywhere, strongly excited for the poor slaves, and we often expressed our views of slavery, even to the slaveholders. Robert and his father see the auction of slaves, including a baby torn from its mother's arms. Robert would occasionally be asked what he thought of slavery, and he said, 'It is wrong enough to damn the whole of them.' Robert returned to Marion, teaching again. He and his brother Clark decided to pursue law together, and both were admitted to the bar in July 1854. He and Clark set up a law firm in Peoria, Illinois. There is a statue of Robert Ingersoll in Peoria, also pictured on my poster. It was refurbished in, I think, 1980 by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ingersoll and his family lived in Peoria for several years. 4 years later, Robert is writing that his prospects in law are very bright indeed. He and Clark, his brother, were well-liked and getting more and more business. Robert at this time was becoming interested in politics. He's a Republican, back when the Republicans were the more progressive party. Robert knows he is a good speaker, and he's taking part every other week in the debating lyceum. His good company and his ability to entertain are spoken highly of. He's a natural storyteller with an inexhaustible supply of brilliant wit. Ingersoll runs for Congress. In a debate with his opponent, he declares, "The fugitive slave law is the most infamous enactment that ever disgraced the statute book." This, of course, is the law that required all escaped slaves to be returned to their masters and not protected. The man who approves or apologizes for that infamy is a brute. Ingersoll loses. After the Civil War, Ingersoll is around 30, and he's feeling his age. He worries about accomplishing things and almost thinks it's too late. He considers going back to law. Also on his mind is the lecturing platform. He could hardly imagine how successful he would soon be. He returns to his wife, whom he married just before the war. His wife, Eva, is described as strikingly handsome with a quick smile. She was actually an agnostic before Ingersoll fully embraced that stance, and she would influence him too. The marriage is highly successful and very happy, and the family is very close. The Ingersolls would have 2 children. Their daughter, Eva, would grow up to be the famous suffragist and feminist Eva Ingersoll Brown. Robert becomes his brother Clark's campaign manager, gives numerous speeches. His brother goes to Congress. Ingersoll is reading various works, including Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, also John Draper, Auguste Comte, Voltaire. In 1866, he will give his first iconoclastic speech, Progress. Ingersoll is greatly influenced by Voltaire and will eventually lecture on him. He begins giving many talks in Peoria, some of which still include references to God, one a memorial to Lincoln, and another on the anniversary of the 86th Illinois Regiment, which Ingersoll himself had raised at the start of the war. But the townspeople doubt his sincerity. They know he never goes to church. They've heard of gatherings where Ingersoll and some of his ilk meet and discuss what they say is blasphemy. Picking from some quotes of Ingersoll, theology is the only dishonest science, the only one that is based on belief, on credulity, the only one that abhors investigation, that despises thought and denounces reason. All Orthodox churches of all ages have been the enemies of science. They attacked the astronomers as though they were criminals, the geologists as though they were assassins. They regarded physicians as the enemies of God, as men who were trying to defeat the decrees of providence. The biologists, the anthropologists, the archaeologists, the readers of ancient inscriptions, the delvers in buried cities, were all hated by the theologians. They were afraid that these men might find something inconsistent with the Bible. If all Christians would admit that all have an equal right to think, then the question is forever solved. But as long as organized and powerful churches pretending to hold the keys of heaven and hell denounce every person as an outcast and criminal who thinks for himself and denies their authority, the world will be filled with hatred and suffering. To hate man and to worship God seems to be the sum of all creeds. If cathedrals had been universities, if dungeons of the Inquisition had been laboratories, if Christians had believed in character instead of creed, if they had taken from the Bible all the good and thrown away the wicked and absurd, this world, he concludes, would be a much better place. Ingersoll again from the truth. It will not do to say that certain ideas are sacred and that man has not the right to investigate and test these ideas for himself. Who knows that they are sacred? Can anything be sacred to us that we do not know to be true? For many centuries, free speech has been an insult to God. Nothing has been more blasphemous than the expression of honest thought. For many ages, the lips of the wise were sealed. The torches that truth had lighted, that courage carried, were extinguished with blood. Truth has always been in favor of free speech, but always asked to be has always asked to be investigated, has always longed to be known and understood. Freedom, discussion, honesty, investigation, and courage are the friends and allies of truth. Truth loves the light in the open field. It appeals to the senses, to the judgment, the reason, to all the higher and nobler faculties and powers of the mind. It seeks to calm the passions, to destroy prejudice, and to increase the volume and intensity of reason's flame. Ingersoll's audiences were highly amused by his attacks on the Catholic Church. He could get away with saying, in the 16th century, a man was burned in France because he refused to kneel to a procession of dirty monks. They tolerated his anti-Catholic sentiments until he began attacking religion in general. Then he was attacked by the conservative press in Peoria, who criticized the Ingersolls in vile terms. Clark urged his brother to run for Congress. Robert declined because he worried he'd hurt his brother's career, and says that his own law practice would suffer too much. But Ingersoll was active, helping and advising his brother back in Washington. He was also continuing to read widely and made regular excursions to Chicago to buy books. In 1868, he ran for Attorney General of Illinois and won, the only public office he'd ever hold. He was urged by fellow Republicans to run for the governorship, but they urged him to conceal his agnostic views. Robert refused. He lost the race, which was a big blow to him. Someone in Ingersoll's day had said that Ingersoll would surely have been elected President of the United States if not for his agnostic beliefs. Such was his persuasion as a speaker. Clark writes his brother that Robert has done a magnificent thing in refusing to sacrifice his convictions for political reward. He tells Robert how grateful he is for his devotion, advice, and inspiration, and signs off the letter, "The world will hear from you soon. On that I stake everything I possess." Ingersoll remains active in the party, speaking tirelessly for many candidates throughout his career, helping them to win. Ingersoll's lectures and law business often take him away from home for 3 or 4 days at a time. And he worries he's indulging too much in tobacco and spirits. He was watching his weight. He's 227 pounds at one time in 1871. He gives up tea, coffee, drink, and tobacco, smoking and chewing. Of this resistance to bad habits, he says, "I am going to continue in the good cause until I satisfy myself whether the effect upon me is good or bad." He decided it was bad. "Total abstinence," he wrote, "has killed thousands." Ingersoll's lectures brought cheers and gales of laughter. After even 2 hours, audiences would yell for more. The Bangor Whig and Courier wrote, "The magnetism of the speaker must be felt. The indescribable influence must be experienced in order to appreciate his wonderful power. He held the assemblage by a spell more potent than that of any man we have ever heard speak." In the late 1860s, Ingersoll, not yet nationally known, was giving heretical lectures, not just in Peoria, but throughout the Midwest. By 1877, he's arranging the itinerary for his first transcontinental lecture tour. In the early years of his lecturing, he would make from $200 to $2,400 an appearance. Later in his career, $400 to $7,000 an appearance. He would become very wealthy. Ingersoll was so full of fun that one laughed in spite of himself at the irreverent, a listener said. Another said, "He bantered us, he challenged us, electrified us. At times his eloquence held us silent. At times we cheered almost every sentence, like delegates at a political convention." Ingersoll eventually left Peoria for Washington in 1877. There is a statue of Ingersoll in Peoria pictured here on the poster. I think I said that already, didn't I? In 1885, the family settled in New York, attracted by the many theaters, concert halls, museums, all the arts. They moved to 101 Fifth Avenue, a mansion with a solid marble hall and a Steinway grand in the middle parlor, which Ingersoll bought for $150,000. "I got it at a splendid bargain," he wrote. There would be a few more moves within New York City over the years. The parties at the Ingersolls were legendary. He was great company, and the house was full of music and fun. The guests included many well-known artists, actors, politicians, musicians, and others. Though wealthy, Ingersoll was extremely generous and gave money to many, many causes, and also helped his poorer relations. His investments weren't so successful, and he once said that he had a positive genius for losing money. He continued his work in law, argued several important cases. In the 1880s, labor troubles heat up. In 1886, Ingersoll writes a lay sermon against the exploitation of poor workers. "Don't you know that if people could bottle the air, they would? Don't you know that there would be an American Air Bottling Association? And don't you know that they would allow thousands and millions to die for want of breath if they could not pay for air? He publishes an essay, The 8-Hour Day Must Come. Biographer Susan Jacoby writes, Ingersoll repudiated the social Darwinism that was as much an article of faith for many wealthy misinterpreters of Darwin's theory of evolution as Genesis was for religious fundamentalists. Endorsing both the 8-hour day and the right of workers to strike, Ingersoll insisted the working people should be protected by law. If they are not, the capitalists will require just as many hours as human nature can bear. Ingersoll lectured on Darwin. Jacoby again. Who knows how long it would have taken for Darwin's scientific ideas to have made it into high school biology texts without Ingersoll speaking to the public in the everyday language, till the farmer and laborer would think, now I understand it. To the creationist belief that all the beauty in the world proved a loving God's existence, Ingersoll once shocked even the non-believers in his audience, describing at length the beauty of cancer under a microscope, how colorful, how amazing and wonderful it looked as it spread, how ingenious and clever its transformations. To the worry that a belief in our descent from lesser animals degraded us, Ingersoll said, I had rather belong to a race that started from the skull-less vertebrates in the dim Laurentian seas, swimming, not knowing where they were going, but that in some way began to develop and began to get a little higher and a little higher, that they came up by degrees through millions of ages and finally produced the man in the dugout. And then from this man getting a little grander, and each one calling everyone who made a little advance an infidel or an atheist. For in the history of this world, the man who is ahead has always been called a heretic. I would rather come from a race that started from that skull-less vertebrate and came up and finally produced Shakespeare, a race that has an angel of progress beckoning men forward, upward, onward, forever. I had rather belong to such a race, commencing there, than to have sprung from a perfect pair upon which the Lord has lost money every moment from that day to this. One of the most famous pro-science speakers of Ingersoll's day was Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, often mistakenly attributed to Darwin. Spencer made the error of arguing that the survival of the fittest could and should be applied to civilized man, and so justifying the vast Gilded Age gap between the rich and the poor. Although Spencer and Ingersoll were friends, Ingersoll did not make the social Darwinist mistake of believing that tooth and claw should be the rule in civilized societies. His rejection of social Darwinism at a time when many freethinkers, to their discredit, shared the views of conservative religious believers about the natural inferiority of the poor, immigrants, and blacks, raises Ingersoll above most of his contemporaries in American secular thought. There are two distinct threads in the history of American secularism. The first, descending from the humanism and egalitarianism of Paine, and the second, that's Thomas Paine, and the second from 19th century socialist Darwinism through the 20th century every man for himself objectivism of Ayn Rand. A true descendant of Paine, Ingersoll linked reason and science to the success and survival of democracy, as the Enlightenment founders did, and contended that the capacity for rational thought existed among all the races and social classes. Ingersoll's belief in the intellectual potential of those at every level of society, coupled with his own modest origins, added considerable weight to the message he delivered in small towns, where farmers were more likely to show up than university professors. Ingersoll argued that empathy was a part of our evolution as humans, agreeing with Darwin himself that unlike nature, civilized man cares for the weaker members, does not exterminate them. I quote Darwin here. The aid which we feel impelled to give the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered more tender and widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy, even at the urging of hard reason, without the deterioration in the noblest part of our nature. Another great subject of Ingersoll's was founding father and freethinker Thomas Paine. Paine was the great hero of the American Revolution and the author of The Rights of Man and the Age of Reason. Jacoby says that Ingersoll saw Paine's obscurity at the end of the 19th century as nothing less than a crime against the true history of the United States. Of Thomas Paine, Ingersoll wrote, "He knew that the throne skulked behind the altar, and both behind a pretended revelation from God." Paine lived out his creed that the world is my country, and to do good my religion. The American Revolution couldn't have been won without Paine, and yet because of Paine's stand for reason and free thought, he was left out of the story of the founding of our democracy. In his great lecture, Thomas Paine, Ingersoll told the story of the poor young Paine and his travels to America from England, how he came to America because he could do nothing in England where, quote, those two vultures, church and state, were ready to tear in pieces and devour the heart of anyone who might deny their divine right to enslave the world. Ingersoll's reinstatement of Paine as a champion of American democracy is considered one of his greatest achievements. Towards the end of Ingersoll's life, he lectured on the rights of women. He wrote, "There will never be a generation of great men until there has been a generation of great women." And, "Woman is not the intellectual inferior of man. She has lacked not mind, but opportunity." Nothing gives greater promise for the future than the fact that woman is achieving intellectual and physical liberty. He supported birth control and wrote, "Science must make woman the owner, the mistress of herself, must put it in the power of woman to decide for herself whether she will or will not become a mother. This frees women." Ingersoll was loved and admired by legions, but there were also outrageous stories, lies told about him and his family in the press. To one of these attacks, which said his son was a drunkard and that several times he had to be carried away from the table, Ingersoll replied, "It is not true that intoxicating beverages are served at my table. It is not true that my son was ever drunk. It is not true that my son had to be carried away from the table. Besides, I have no son." His daughters were attacked in the press also, and said to have been forced into blasphemy. Maud, his daughter, took issue with this. "Although our father has always wished for us to study and think for ourselves, we agree with him heartily in his religious beliefs." Some religious people called him the rude iconoclast, taking away and giving nothing in return. Ingersoll replied, "We do not want creeds, we do not want idols, we want knowledge, we want happiness." He went on, "And yet we are told in the church that we have accomplished nothing, that we are simply destroyers. Is it nothing to free the mind? Is it nothing to civilize mankind? Is it nothing to fill the world with light, with discovery? Is it nothing to dignify man and exalt the intellect? Is it a small thing to relieve the heavens of an insatiate monster and write upon the eternal dome, glittering with stars, the grand word freedom? Is it a small thing to quench the flames of hell, to unbind the martyr from the stake, break all the chains, stay the sword of the fanatic, and tear the bloody hands of the church from the throat of science? Do not be frightened. Do not be afraid to doubt. Your doubts are the smartest things about you," he insisted. "I have not torn the good down. I have only endeavored to trample out the ignorant, cruel fires of hell. I do not tear away the passage, 'God will be merciful to the merciful.' I do not destroy the promise, 'If you forgive others, God will forgive you.' There is no darkness but ignorance, no light but intelligence." Some may ask, "Are you trying to take our religion away?" To such I answer, no. Superstition is not a religion. To love justice, to long for the right, to love mercy, to pity the suffering, to assist the weak, to forget wrongs and remember benefits, to love the truth, to be sincere, to utter honest words, to love liberty. And he continues with a list of virtues: courage, generosity, and concludes, to receive new truths with gladness, to cultivate hope, to do the best that can be done, and then to be resigned. This is the religion of reason, the creed of science. This satisfies the brain and heart. Ingersoll called this the gospel of humanity. He said that his secular creed was not one of seeking salvation or atonement of sins, but simply the best way to have a happy life. Our fathers did the best they could, he acknowledged. They thought that sacrifice and prayer, fasting and weeping would induce the supernatural to give them sunshine, rain, and harvest. It is, of course, very interesting that Robert Ingersoll and Mark Twain were good friends. Twain first heard Ingersoll speak at a banquet for President Grant at a hotel in Chicago. When the party broke up around 5 in the morning, Twain went to his room and wrote to his wife, "I've just come to my room, Libby darling, and I guess this was the most memorable night of my life. By George, I never was so stirred since I was born. I heard 4 speeches, one by that splendid old soul, Colonel Bob Ingersoll." And this was followed by voluminous praise of Ingersoll's style and character. And it's surprising that Walt Whitman, the great mystic poet, admired and loved Robert Ingersoll as he did. The feeling was mutual. Whitman was Robert's favorite American poet. About Ingersoll, Whitman wrote, "It should not be surprising that I am drawn to Ingersoll, for he is Leaves of Grass. He lives, embodies the individuality I preach. I see in Bob the noblest specimen, American flavored, pure out of the soil, spreading, giving, demanding light." The friendship was mostly conducted by letters, but the two had visited a number of times. Ingersoll would give the eulogy at Whitman's funeral in 1892, where 3,000 people crowded the place where his tomb stood. His final words, or Ingersoll's final words, were, "And so I lay this little wreath upon this great man's tomb. I loved him living and I love him still." As Ingersoll himself lay dying 7 years later, he knew that the conservative press and clergy would manufacture news such as a deathbed conversion or his suicide for a misspent life. So he wished to have gathered around him all the family and some friends who were there when he died. And with his wife, friends, and family in the house, his wife holding his hand, he died smiling. He was only 65, dead of congestive heart failure. Of course, the press and the clergy did report a deathbed conversion, if not, of Ingersoll's death having been a probable suicide over his misspent life. But all the witnesses to his death scoffed at these false stories in the paper. The Chicago Tribune, though, had the headline read, "Ingersoll dies smiling." The New York Times wrote, "He earned great sums of money, both as a lecturer and a lawyer, but he let them go like water. It was his habit to keep money in the house in an open drawer to which any member of his family was free to go and take what he wanted." Of course, there were many, many tributes to Ingersoll, especially on the left, and one of the most powerful came from Eugene V. Debs, the great labor organizer and pacifist. The name of Robert G. Ingersoll is written in the pantheon of the world. More than any other man, he destroyed religious superstition. Like an electric storm, he purified the religious atmosphere. With rare courage and brilliant ability, he applied himself to his tasks. He was the Shakespeare of oratory. Ingersoll lived and died far in advance of his time. He fought nobly for the transformation of this world into a habitable place. Mark Twain wrote to the grieving Eva Ingersoll, "Except for my daughters, I have not grieved for any death as I have grieved for his. His was a great and beautiful spirit. My reverence for him was deep and genuine." The Chicago Tribune noted, "To all Americans who have heard and seen Ingersoll on the stump or platform, and their name is legion, the news of his departure from this world to another, which he had no faith in, will be a surprise and a shock. They will feel they have lost an old familiar friend whose wit has made them shriek with laughter and whose pathos has unsealed the fountains of their tears. The Stockton Daily Record. He will be appreciated as a hero, and it is a grand compliment to the intelligence of the present age that he was not also a martyr. The Catholic world tried to condemn him with this comment, which would have very much pleased Ingersoll. He is the nearest approach we Americans have had to Voltaire. In her biography of Ingersoll, Susan Jacoby makes this plea: there ought to be some sort of atheist hall of fame. It would not be large. For those who refuse to engage in religious hypocrisy to further their political ambitions. Ingersoll belongs there. She says, to him the glory of the founding generation was that it did not establish a Christian nation. There is no establishment figure who says anything of the kind in America today. He was certainly not a scientist, Jacoby says, a philosopher or a historian recognized by scholarly institutions, but that was precisely Ingersoll's strength. He believed that reason was available to and attainable by the many, and not restricted to the educated few. When Ingersoll was asked, as he put it, what do you propose? You have torn this down. What do you propose to give in place of it? Well, in the first place, I propose good fellowship, good friends all around. No matter what we believe, shake hands and let it go. That is your opinion. This is mine. Let us be friends. They say belief is important. I say no, actions are important. Judge by deed, not by creed. Good fellowship, good friends, mutual respect. About the religious. We have had too many of these solemn people. No man of any humor ever founded a religion. Never. Humor sees both sides. Elsewhere, Ingersoll answered this question of what is left without God. The world remains with homes and firesides where grow and bloom the virtues of our race. Let the ghosts go. We will worship them no more. Let them cover their eyeless sockets with their fleshless hands and fade forever from the imagination of men. Susan Jacoby again. You new atheists should consider it your special duty and privilege to work tenaciously for the restoration of the memory of this old American freethinker. You owe him. So does every American, religious or non-religious, who enjoys and takes for granted that liberty of conscience is meant for thee as well as for me, the greatest secular idea of all. Happiness is the only good, reason the only torch, justice the only worship, humanity the only religion, and love the only priest. Robert Ingersoll. Thank you.